Right. So this is day 9. This is the opposition to Vietnam. And so this is going to go through all the different hippie movements. Now, I will talk about the hippies in 1960. However, in the 1960 protest, I don't bring this up much, sparingly. But we'll see how that works. Now, as I said, 1964 was the escalation of Vietnam. This meant we can commit more troops and we're going to get more involved. And so what's the big deal here? If you remember, I told you Johnson promised something when he was elected in 1964. We seek no wider war. Yet that very same year, he's committing troops. So people are beginning to not trust Johnson. And this is called a credibility gap. That means what the politicians are saying and what you're believing, there's a space between them. And that exists in some point today with all politicians. Now, in 1964, at the Democratic National Convention, what was supposed to happen is Johnson will accept the nomination for president, and he can talk about how we're going to commit troops and how we're going to win Vietnam. There is, however, a major problem, and it's right there in the picture. A party showed up called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They are an all-African-American branch of the Democratic Party from Mississippi, and they wanted a seat on the floor. They wanted to be able to cast their vote saying that Johnson's going to get the presidency. Now, why is it such a big deal? If they are present, and they're the only ones, Johnson can't talk about Vietnam. He's going to have to talk about civil rights. The big deal was in 1963, prior to being assassinated, JFK had gone on TV following the Birmingham March and the March on Washington and announced a civil rights bill, a sweeping legislation. And so they want that promise fulfilled, and there's a lot of things there. So Johnson goes to the man. He hadn't picked his VP at this point, his vice presidential, and he goes to a man named Hubert Humphrey. And he goes, if you want to be my vice president, you solve this problem, the problem being the African-American Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He did solve it, got them space in the convention, however, not on the floor, compromised, and he will become the vice presidential candidate in 1964. He's also the one who runs in 1968 that Nixon beats, so we'll get there. Now, a major thing occurs, and this is highly chaotic, okay? Norman Morrison, who you can tell from the Baltimore Sun, was a Quaker. Now, a Quaker is a religious group, and above all, the Quakers do not believe in war. They see it as evil and immoral. So, this man, Norman Morrison, and his wife had discussions about a practice called self-immolation, and maybe I'll get into that in a second. So he sets out one day in 1965 with his baby to go to the Pentagon. He calls for Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense. McNamara goes to his window. There's some type of exchange, and what happens? He commits suicide. He sets himself on fire, which is self-immolation. Now, the baby will be safe. His baby is safe. Somebody said, save the child. He tossed the baby to someone in the crowd. And so he is this. Now, this does scar Robert McNamara. In fact, when we look at Fog of War, he brings it up, and you can tell just the way that this is focused, much like these videos. You don't lose sight of my face. You can tell this bothers him, that this was something that really, really got to him because it showed all these crazy things. So, again, self-immolation is the idea of setting yourself on fire. In fact, there's a very famous picture in your book of a Buddhist monk in South Vietnam setting himself on fire. And above all, the biggest thing is this is a religious practice, and they actually believe in not even committing to pain. Highly big. Now, Robert McNamara, Norman Morrison, is what we're going to call a conscientious objector, meaning he's not going to participate in the war on moral grounds. Now, there is a much, much more famous conscientious objector, and that is the recently departed Muhammad Ali. He passed away a few months ago in this video, in July 2016. Now, Muhammad Ali will be drafted into the U.S. military. However, he will refuse to go on moral grounds, saying that his religion, which was the Nation of Islam, does not permit him to fight. They sue him, they try all these different things. ultimately putting him in jail. And as you can tell, his greatest fight, he was a boxer, is when his birth given name here in the United States was Cassius Clay, will sue the United States of America over the conscription bill, the draft. In class, we'll look at the draft, would you have been drafted, etc. This is really, really chaotic. I'm really dragging on here. So what ultimately happens? They rule in favor of Cassius Clay. They say the conscious objectors can't exist. You don't have to get people to go into the draft. I know that's chaotic, but there we go. Now, in 1966 and 1967, we have the first mass city protest. New York City, thousands of people set out. They're burning their draft cards. They're doing all this, and this is a big, big movement. The hippie movement is really getting steam here in 66 and 67 and saying, hell no, we won't go, and different things like that. And this is unheard of at this point, that they're not listening and they're not doing as they're told. Then we have 1968. Remember, I called it the year of coming apart. At the Democratic Convention in 1968, the Democrats are going to choose Hubert Humphrey as the vice president. However, outside in Chicago, a line of protesters are going to form against a line of police. We don't know who started it. They are there. Rocks are thrown, etc. The police respond to violence with more violence, and in the end, the police beat hundreds of protesters. There were deaths on both sides. Both sides are blaming the other, and this looks horribly chaotic. And how on earth can we do this? Now I'm going to stop here for a minute because, jump on my soapbox, there's been a movement the past few years of Black Lives Matters, and there's a lot of parallel here, okay? There's a ton of parallel here. Meaning, if you're going to protest the police, you must do so in a peaceful manner. If you respond with pay threats and rocks, the police are going to respond with force. That's the way it works. The other big thing, guys, is these minor little protests are not very effective. To get someone's attention, you've got to march on Washington. You've got to go and get the lawmakers behind you, okay? Ultimately, they will do that in the March on Washington, etc. So, off my soapbox for a minute, let's continue going. Also, 1968 was one of the most horrible things that America were associated with in Vietnam, and that was the My Lai massacre, or My Lai. Now, in the My Lai or My Lai massacre, it was an army unit went in and wiped out an entire village. Problem is, a lot of women and children. And this is horrifying. And the photographers, remember Living Room 1, they are there, and they see this, and they release the pictures. This is ghastly. How can they do this? Now, the man who shared the guilt, the guy who was in charge of this army unit was Lieutenant William Calley. Lieutenant William Calley will serve a minor amount of jail time. Ultimately, there's a lot of big chaotic things associated with that. Now, some protest songs and some big protest songs here, and we'll listen to these in class. Creedence Clearwater Revival brought to our attention that not all men were drafted. Not if you were a fortunate son or a senator's son with a silver spoon in your hand. I'm quoting some lyrics. And then, of course, we have the Bob Dylan protest song, which was made popular by Jimi Hendrix all along the Watchtower, in which it's talking about troops being guarded and all this chaotic things that ensue with that. Now, Vietnam in film, there are a ton of really good Vietnam films, and what we begin to notice is a lot of them have this anti-war rhetoric. A couple that come to mind just real quick. There's one called Platoon, very, very good movie. There's one about going into boot camp called Full Metal Jacket. I would not recommend watching that one with kids near you because it's horrible in there. And if you go in the military, understand why. Then we kind of have Stanley Kubrick's version, and it's called Apocalypse Now, which gives us the all-time great quote of "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." And probably one of my particular favorites, I wouldn't suggest this unless it's much, much later in life, is Tom Cruise and Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July. in which he's drafted out of high school and he comes back as a quadriplegic, and all these different things that are there. Also brings to our attention the idea of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. An interesting band, a rock band called Five Finger Death Punch, used PTSD and the way the veterans are treated now, and that's an interesting thing. If you don't like the music because it's a little heavy, mute it and just watch the scenes and see how it plays out and the facts that are there. The veterans with PTSD, they have to be recognized. We've got to do something for them. So that's the first protest video. The next one, we're going to kind of carry on.